Morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you might happen to be watching this. I'm glad that you've tuned in to the Cross Sunday School. My name is Sam Lamerson, and we have been thinking about the question, is it true? That is the gospel story of Jesus really true? And the real problem, the sticking point for the gospel story, the reason that many choose not to believe the gospel story is not that Jesus was born. Virtually every historian will grant the fact that a man named Jesus actually existed. What creates the problem is the resurrection. That is a miracle of the resurrection. And one of the problems, as I mentioned last week, with understanding or believing the resurrection is that it goes against the laws of nature. And a philosopher named Hume decided that and made a critical argument that miracles simply do not happen. He defined miracles in essence, and this is a great simplification of Hume. He defined miracles as God violating the laws of nature. I think that's not a good definition of what a miracle really is. And so here, I think, is a better definition. A better definition is the intervention of a supernatural agent to produce an effect which natural laws and processes would not produce. So it needs to have some kind of a supernatural agent, and it needs to have an effect that wouldn't happen naturally. And so Hume put forth a variety of arguments about the reasons why miracles cannot occur, or at least if they occur, they cannot be verified in today's world. The first argument that Hume gives us is this idea that it's always more likely that a supposed miracle is a misinterpreted natural event. There's a very famous event in psychic and sort of medium history by who in that time would have been called a medium. Today he would be called a psychic, named David Douglas Hume, D.D. Hume. No relation to the philosopher Hume. His name is spelled H-O-M-E, but it's pronounced Hume. And the idea is, and you could find this probably on the internet, certainly in a library, there's the idea that Daniel Douglas Hume took a walk out of a second-story window, and he walked around midair and then walked in a different window of the second floor. So that seems like a miraculous event. It seems like an event which we would say there's some violation of the laws of nature. However, when we look more carefully at precisely what happened, and there's a book published in the 1980s that looks very carefully at the first-hand accounts of what happened that night and how it all took place. And it's much more likely that what happened in that case was not that a man walked on air. It's much more likely that what happened was there was a ledge outside on which this psychic or medium stood, and then he walked on that ledge over to the other window and came in that way. And so what seemed at first, at least to many of the people who were there, seemed at first to be a supernatural event, actually was nothing more than a misinterpretation of a natural event. And so it wasn't supernatural, it was just natural. That's what Hume says is almost always the case with these miracles. It's that something has been misinterpreted. So, for example, if you saw a man walking on water, you would be right to say, well, is there something invisible underneath the water on which he's walking? Is there some kind of a trick that I'm not seeing? And you would be right to say that. So Hume, in some sense, is partially right. It's not always more likely. Otherwise, one must say there is no supernatural and there cannot be a supernatural event. So it's not always more likely, but it's at least somewhat likely that something that seems to be a miracle is actually a misinterpretation of what is actually a natural event. It's the same thing you would think if you go to see a magic show and the magician causes a girl to float. You know in your mind that it's a trick. You don't know how the trick works when he passes a hoop over the girl and when she floats out into the audience. You don't know how that works. But you know in your mind that people today don't float. And so you are much quicker to ascribe that to a natural event rather than to a miracle. But there's a second argument that Hume makes, and that is the witnesses to miracles are ignorant and cannot be relied upon. Now, this is a much less persuasive argument that Hume makes, because he presumes upon what is sort of the intelligence of the modern mind. Hume makes this presumption that people in Jesus' day were pre-Enlightenment, and because they were pre-Enlightenment, their testimony cannot be trusted. There's this idea that only after the Enlightenment do we really know what's going on. Do we really have any idea of the truth of scientific fact? And as a result, all these stories of miracles that come from the ancient world, they cannot be trusted. And yet we've already looked carefully at that argument when we looked at the second question. Did the gospel writers believe what they wrote? And we saw that both Paul and Peter believed what they wrote. Now, to call the Apostle Paul, an ignorant person is to misunderstand what's really going on. Paul was certainly one of the most highly educated persons of his time. He knew the Hebrew Bible very carefully. He said that he had seen Jesus, and he faced death and was eventually beheaded because of the fact that he said he had seen Jesus. And so to call these ancient witnesses ignorant is to really almost engage in a form of ageism. That is, it's only our age that really knows the truth. And so to call every witness ignorant when they claim they've seen a miracle before the Enlightenment and even after, Hume would say even today, if someone claims to have seen a miracle, the witnesses can't be trusted. They can't be relied upon simply because they didn't really know what happened. And so we say, Mr. Hume, the argument that you made at first was somewhat persuasive. This argument is less persuasive. This idea that the people that saw the miracles were ignorant and cannot be relied upon. I mean, let's begin to think about what was going on here. These were disciples who had been with Jesus for his years, at least during his ministry. And these same disciples said that they saw him come up from the dead. They saw him walking around. They saw the nail prints in his hands and his feet. They saw the scar in his side. And so, as a result of that, they knew who Jesus was. It wasn't some twin. It wasn't some other kind of thing. This argument from Hume, I think we can agree, really doesn't hold much strength for us. Argument number 3. This is Hume again. Because all religions claim miracles, and these religions oppose each other, miracles can't be true. Now, let's think about this for a moment. First of all, is it true that all religions claim miracles? It's not. Major religions claim miracles, but there are lots and lots of other religions who do not claim miracles. But even if they did, does the fact that they disagree with each other mean that those miracles can't be true? There are a lot of very strange things that happen in the Bible. For example, remember there was a place where Elijah the prophet was buried, and someone else was thrown in there dead. And when he touched Elijah the prophet's dead bones, he came back to life. Now, that's a very strange event in the text of the Scripture. We're not quite sure how to make all that work out. It's one of the passages that the Roman Catholic Church uses to argue that there ought to be relics. You know, a relic is a part of the body of a saint, so you could have, a leg of John the Baptist or something like that. And they argue that keeping the relics is the same as keeping the body of Elisha, should be the same sort of thing. And my point is that there are all these strange things, and not all of these events that happen in the Bible that are miraculous, or at least that seem miraculous, come from God. There are events that happen in the Bible that seem miraculous that come from the evil one. There are times when the evil one takes Jesus up to the highest point of the temple, probably in some sort of mental image, but there are certainly events where an evil force does some things that we would consider to border on being miraculous. For example, the Saul and the witch of Endor at the end of 2 Samuel. You remember that event. It's the end of Saul's reign, and he brings up he finds a medium or a witch, and she brings up this image, apparently, of Samuel. Now, there are a variety of ideas about what happened there, and it may well be that Saul was tricked, but at least for Saul, he thought that this was a miraculous experience. So, just because religions differ from one another doesn't mean that they may not have what might be called false miracles. That is, miracles that are controlled and brought about by the evil one rather than controlled and brought about by God. So I don't think that this argument from David Hume really lends itself a great deal of strength, because we would all agree that the major religions do claim miraculous events. The question we would have with them would be the three questions that we're asking in this course. Number one, is the textual evidence sufficient? That is, do we have what the original viewers of the miracle, do we have what they actually wrote? And then secondly, did they believe what they actually wrote? And then thirdly, did what they actually wrote actually take place? And those are three very significant questions, and I believe that you will not find very many things that you can put to that test outside of the text of the Scripture. So let's look at a sort of a minimal defense of the resurrection. And by that I mean, what are the minimum claims that can be used to defend the resurrection of Jesus Christ? This is first used by Gary Habermas from Liberty University. I've mentioned him before as being one of the great experts on resurrection in general, and the resurrection of Jesus in particular. And so Habermas has created this, what he calls minimal facts of the resurrection. And there are 5 minimal facts that will help us to sort of understand what's going on. And these facts are facts that ought to be allowed even by Hume, because they're very basic facts. And so let's look at them. First, fact number 1 is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Very few historical scholars will today deny that Jesus died by crucifixion. Almost all scholars, whether they be Christian, Jewish, agnostic, atheist, whatever kind of scholars they might be, they will agree that there was a man named Jesus, that he went about, people thought he was doing some kind of miracles, that the Roman government got afraid of him because he was getting so much popular support, and so eventually they crucified him. Probably the event that sort of caused the crucifixion was Jesus' temple action. When Jesus went into the temple and said, I'm going to overthrow these tables of these people who are doing these things, that certainly was a problem. And the Roman government didn't want that kind of thing going on. They didn't want a riot starting, and so they call in Jesus and eventually they crucify him. So almost everyone today will believe that Jesus died by crucifixion. Crucifixion was a horrible death. We've mentioned it before. There are a variety of different ways that one were crucified, sometimes on one pole, sometimes on a cross like what we would expect, sometimes on different forms of the cross. Sometimes people were tortured while they were hanging there. There in Josephus, there's a record of a man who was crucified, and while he was hanging there, watching his family was killed in front of him. It was just a horrible thing. So there's no doubt that Jesus, A, was crucified, and B, that he died. The Roman soldiers knew how to make sure that someone was dead. That was their job. That was what they did a lot of the time. This was, in all likelihood, not the first person that they had ever crucified. And so when they want to make sure that someone was dead, there were two things that they did. Either they would break their legs, which happened to the two thieves beside Jesus, we remember from the Gospel of John. John says Jesus' legs were not broken so that he could fulfill a prophecy. And interestingly enough, they, in addition to breaking someone's legs, if they wanted to know that a person were really already dead, they would stab them with a sword, and they stabbed Jesus, and blood and water came out. They were convinced that he was dead. And so I think that this first fact of the minimal facts that we know that we can all agree on, whether we be Christian, whether we be Jewish, whether we be agnostic, whatever, a historian can agree that Jesus was crucified. There's almost no one in scholarship today who would argue that this is not true. There are a few people, but most of them are on the fringe, and by that I mean the real fringe of New Testament thinking and New Testament writing. So that's fact number one, that Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number two is that Jesus was buried in a known tomb. Now this is a very important minimal fact, because the text of the New Testament says very clearly that Jesus was put into the tomb of a man named Joseph of Arimathea. So this was a known tomb. The text of the New Testament very clearly tells us that Jesus, after being put into this tomb, he was, in essence, there was a stone that was rolled in front of the tomb. Now, you can see it a little bit in the image here, if you can see the image close enough. The stone was really big, and to unroll it, it would take a couple of men at the very least. If you've ever been to Israel, you've seen these kinds of tombs from that period in history. And you realize that they would roll the stone there in many ways to keep animals out. But in this case, they rolled the stone, and they did more than that. They sealed the stone, the Gospels tell us, and after sealing the stone, Roman soldiers, Roman guards were put there to make sure that the body wasn't stolen. So all of that is the gospel writers going to a great length to tell us that we know that Jesus was buried in a known tomb. And we know where that tomb was today. Now, there's some dispute about, if you go to Jerusalem, you will remember, there's some dispute about which of the two tombs actually belong to Jesus. There's one where there's a shrine built by the Roman Catholic Church, and there's another called the Garden Tomb that is beside a rock that sort of looks like a skull. Called Gordon's Tomb, or Gordon's Calvary. Unfortunately, most modern evidence points against Gordon's Calvary. Even though it looks more like what a Protestant wishes the tomb would look like, it's probably not the real tomb. The real tomb is, in all likelihood, at least sort of statistical likelihood, that tomb where the Roman Catholic Church is built. But it was hundreds of years later when that place was marked. So we can't be certain that today we know where the tomb was. It's probably that. We don't know for sure. We can be sure, though, that those who were writing in the first century knew where the tomb was. They had gone there. They had seen Jesus' body taken there. And so as a result of that, we have to come to the realization that this is a minimal fact. Jesus was buried in a known tomb. That anyone, whether it be a Roman soldier, whether it be a person from the Roman government, or whether it be one of Jesus' followers, any one of them could have gone and very easily found out where exactly that tomb was. It was not a secret in any sense of the world. So we're building this set of minimal facts together, sort of, if you can think of them as the points of a bow tie. The first minimal fact is that Jesus died by crucifixion. The second minimal fact is that Jesus was buried in a known tomb. The third minimal fact is that Jesus' tomb was found empty. That is, this tomb that people knew where it was, they were certain as to being able to go there and see the Roman soldiers, see the stone rolled there. When they went there after the Sabbath on a Sunday morning, they found the stone had been rolled away and that the body of Jesus was gone. So once you grant the fact that the body of Jesus was gone, you must give some sort of an idea as to why that might have happened. Because think about this. If the disciples had gone through Jerusalem proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, all that the Romans or the Jewish leadership, who also hated Jesus, all that they would have to do is simply get the body and drag it through the streets of Jerusalem. And say, you can say he's resurrected all that you want to. Here's his body. We crucified him. He was dead. We knew it. We guarded his tomb so his body couldn't be stolen. And here it is. And yet, there's no record of anyone ever doing anything like that. What we have is record on the other side. That is, Matthew tells us that there was a false rumor that started. Matthew tells us that some of the Jewish leaders went to the Roman soldiers and they said, if anybody comes to you, you come and tell us and tell all the people that his body was stolen. And if you do that, we will pay you money and we will make sure that you keep yourself out of trouble, because they were there to prevent the body from being stolen. So to say that it was stolen would have been to admit that they were not where they should be. So there's once you grant that the tomb was empty, you've got a problem if you're not going to accept the resurrection. And that's why many scholars will say something happened in the work of Jesus and his disciples. Something happened that changed them and made something different. We don't know what it is. We're historians. And so they sidestep the question of what it was that happened, but grant that something very unusual must have happened. Fact number 4 is that there were post-mortem appearances of Jesus. That is, that there were lots of people who claimed that they had seen Jesus. This is not just one guy claiming that Jesus showed up to him on a dark night when he couldn't see very well and it was raining. It's not that. The Apostle Paul, remember, in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians being one of the earliest books in the New Testament, has there in chapter 15 some sort of something that he had learned. And he says, I delivered to you that which I also received. And he says, I absolutely can tell you that Jesus was seen by his disciples. And he was seen by 500 other people, many of whom are still alive. So there's no denying the fact that Jesus did indeed appear to a variety of people. Post-mortem appearances, there's just no doubt. And fact number 5, the lives of the disciples were transformed. This is what historians simply refuse to answer. That is, the lives of the disciples, they were afraid. A crucified Messiah is a dead Messiah. They were afraid that something was going to happen to them like what had happened to Jesus, and so they ran away. And yet, at the end of the day, they were ready to proclaim that Jesus was a Messiah. They were ready to proclaim it not just to get money, like some early critics have said, but they were ready to proclaim it to their death, as we have seen Peter and Paul did. And so when we put these minimal 5 facts together, we come to the realization that even Hume would have to agree that these 5 facts are true. And if these 5 facts are true, we have the minimum we need to understand that the resurrection of Jesus is true, and that a historian can look at the historical records and see that it's true. Next week, we'll look further at some other pieces of evidence beyond minimal facts that we can know to show us that the resurrection is true. Until then, I hope that the Lord blesses you and that you continue to love Him and recognize that He is the resurrected Messiah. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you again next week here at Sunday School at the Cross.